Texas Panhandle, 1883. The harvest supper at the Cedar Falls Church happened every October. Long tables covered in checkered cloth, food brought from every kitchen in the county. The particular warmth of people who have worked hard through a season and have decided to celebrate surviving it. The church hall filled early. The food covered 3 tables. The conversation was loud and comfortable. Walter Holt arrived at 6:30. He was 48 years old, the largest landowner in Cedar Falls County, known for 2 things equally: his fortune and his honesty. He did not attend many social gatherings, not from arrogance, but from the discomfort of a man who has been the most important person in every room for so long that rooms have stopped feeling like rooms and started feeling like audiences. He came tonight because Reverend Cole had asked him personally, and because the supper raised money for the school, which Walter considered worth supporting. He took a plate, he moved along the table, he stopped at the apple pie. He took 1 slice and tasted it, standing there with the distracted attention of a man eating, because eating is necessary, and food is fuel. Then he stopped. He took another bite. He set his fork down and looked at the pie, the way a man looks at something that deserves more than distracted consumption. He looked up. He looked around the room. "Who made this apple pie?" he asked. His voice was not loud, but it carried the voice of a man accustomed to being heard. The room shifted. The women who had organized the supper, Margaret Hale, Dorothy Crane, Louise Fairfield, the women whose names appeared on everything in Cedar Falls, looked at each other with the slight discomfort of people preparing to receive a compliment that is going to a different address. The question hung in the air. Then a silence arrived that was not comfortable, not because nobody knew the answer, because the answer was sitting at the far end of the last table, in a beige linen dress washed so many times the color had become more suggestion than fact, looking at her plate as if the question could not possibly be addressed to anything she had anything to do with. Her name was Roza Calloway. She was 29 years old, and she had been invisible in Cedar Falls for 2 years. She was an ORC, and that fact alone would have been enough to make her peripheral in a town like Cedar Falls. But it was not the only fact. The facts stacked on top of each other, the way stones stack in a cairn, each one adding weight to the structure of her invisibility. Nobody in Cedar Falls had planned to ignore Roza Calloway. These things simply happen in small towns. When your husband dies and you refuse to cry in public or ask for help, people begin to look away when you pass on the boardwalk. When you are also an ORC, with green skin and small tusks and pointed ears, the looking away happens faster and lasts longer because it is easier to treat someone like a ghost than to admit you don't have the courage to help. And it is easiest of all when the ghost looks different from everyone else in town. If this is your first time listening, subscribe to ORC Girl Chronicles and ring the bell for more stories like this. 1. Now, let us get back to the supper. She had come to Cedar Falls when she married Thomas Calloway in 1879. Thomas had been a good man, steady, honest, the quiet decency that doesn't announce itself. He had not cared that she was an ORC. He had met her at a market fair in the next county, where she had been selling preserves for a family she worked for, and he had looked at her the way he looked at everything directly, without flinching, without the particular rearrangement of expression that most humans performed when they found themselves face to face with an ORC woman. He had tasted her apple butter and asked where she learned to cook, and listened to her answer, as if the answer mattered. He had come back the next day with a question he had been carrying overnight, and the question was whether she might consider visiting his farm sometime, because he had a wine-sap apple tree that he thought she would appreciate. She had married him 4 months later. Cedar Falls had absorbed this information the way small towns absorb things that don't fit their expectations, with a polite surface that covered a complicated interior. Thomas Calloway married an ORC woman. The phrasing varied. The tone did not. He had inherited a small farm on the south edge of town from his father. 80 acres of good Texas Panhandle land, sitting high enough in the plains that the winters brought the cold a wine-sap apple tree needed to fruit properly. Thomas had worked it honestly for 4 years before the fever took him in October of 1881. 2 years ago, she had stayed. This was the thing Cedar Falls had not entirely forgiven. Not the debt, not the widow status, but the staying. The unspoken expectation had been that she would go back to wherever she had come from. She was not originally from Cedar Falls. She had no family here. She was an orc on a human man's land, and the man was dead, and the sensible thing would have been to sell the farm and go, return to her own kind. Find an orc settlement somewhere, stop being the green-skinned reminder of something the town preferred not to think about. She had not gone. She worked the farm with 2 hired hands she could barely afford, and managed the debt with the arithmetic of someone who has no margin for error. She planted, harvested, sold at market, made every payment to Harlan Briggs at the lending office on time, and appeared at community events like this. 1. Because appearing was part of belonging, and she was determined to belong even if the belonging was one-sided. She brought food to every gathering, not because anyone asked, but because her mother had taught her that you show up and you bring something and you don't make a fuss about it. Her mother had been an orc woman who understood that the world did not owe you welcome, but that you owed the world your best work, regardless. She had brought the apple pie tonight, her mother's recipe from Georgia, the apples from the wine sap tree Thomas had planted on the east side of the property their first year together. The recipe was the one thing she had from her mother that could not be lost or sold or taken, because it lived in her hands and in her memory, and in the particular knowledge of how long to work a crust before it crossed the line from tender to tough. Her mother had taught her on a wooden table in a kitchen that smelled like cinnamon and wood smoke, and her mother's hands had been green like hers, and her mother's tusks had shone when she smiled the way Rosa's showed. And her mother had said that the only power a woman has that nobody can take away is the power to feed people so well that they remember it. She had set the pie on the table without announcement, the way she set everything on every table, at every gathering, quietly at the edge where the dish would be found rather than presented. She had taken her seat at the far end of the last table, where the light was dim and the conversation flowed around her, without including her, and nobody was likely to notice her specifically. The beige linen dress had been washed so many times, the color had faded to almost nothing against her green skin, and the effect was of a woman who had been washed out along with her clothing, reduced by repetition to something barely visible. She had been sitting there for an hour, her green hands folded in her lap, her small tusks barely visible in the low light, her amber eyes watching the room with a particular attention of someone who has learned to observe celebrations she is not invited to participate in, when the room went quiet and Walter Holt asked his question. She cared for Thomas's memory the same way she cared for that apple tree, without drama, just making sure the ground around it stayed clean and the roots stayed protected from the Texas panhandle cold. The silence lasted 4 seconds. 4 seconds is not a long time by most measures. It is a very long time when a room of 60 people is waiting for someone to answer a direct question from the most powerful man in the county. Margaret Hale looked at the pie. She looked at Walter Holt. She looked at Dorothy Crane beside her. Something passed between them that was not quite speech. Then Dorothy Crane said, "I believe several of us contributed to the dessert table, Mr. Holt," which was true and which answered nothing. Walter looked at Dorothy, he looked at Margaret, he looked at the pie. He had been reading situations for 48 years. "I didn't ask who contributed to the dessert table," he said pleasantly. "I asked who made this specific pie." Another silence. Because at the far end of the last table, Roza Calloway had looked up from her plate, not to draw attention, because the silence was becoming the kind that someone was going to have to end, and she was constitutionally unable to let an uncomfortable silence extend itself past the point of dignity. "I did," she said. Without performance, her voice was clear and steady, and carried the particular composure of a woman who has been overlooked enough times that she has learned to speak without expecting anyone to listen, which gave her words a quality of honesty that more confident voices often lacked. Walter Holt turned and looked at her. The room turned and looked at her too. 60 people redirecting their attention to the orc woman at the end of the last table, the woman who had been sitting there for an hour without anyone addressing her specifically. The green skin and the small tusks and the pointed ears, suddenly visible in a way they had not been when she was just part of the furniture. Rosa held Walter Holt's gaze with the composure of someone who has been overlooked enough times that being looked at directly has become slightly disorienting. "Mrs. Calloway," said Reverend Cole from across the room, supplying the name that Walter had not yet learned. Walter Holt pulled out the chair across from her and sat down as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The richest man in Cedar Falls County, sitting across from the ORC widow at the end of the last table. The room continued to watch. "This is the best apple pie I have eaten in 20 years, Walter said. I'd like to know how you make it." Rosa looked at this man. The fine coat, the gold watch chain, the most important presence in the room, sitting across from her at the end of the last table, looking at her with brown eyes that held genuine interest, rather than the polite vacancy she had grown accustomed to. "It's my mother's recipe," she said, "from Georgia." "Tell me about it," he said. And he meant it. She could hear that he meant it, and it had been long enough since anyone in Cedar Falls had meant something when they said it to her that she felt the difference, immediately and completely. She told him about the recipe. The winesap apples from Thomas's tree, a variety that needed cold winters to fruit properly, which was why the Texas panhandle worked when the lower country didn't. The cinnamon fresh ground, not from a tin sitting on a shelf, since before anyone could remember, the crust worked with lard and cold water until it was right, without being overworked past right. Walter listened and asked 2 questions about oven temperature and the sugar ratio, the questions of someone who understood cooking well enough to ask useful questions about it. "You cook?" she said. "I did," he said. "Before. My wife was a remarkable cook. I learned to pay attention to it." The room had gradually returned to its own conversations. Though not entirely, Margaret Hale appeared at the table with the composed efficiency of a woman reasserting a social order she feels has been disrupted. "Mrs. Calloway, we were hoping you might help clear the dessert table when the supper is finished." Rosa started to stand. "Mrs. Calloway and I are in the middle of a conversation," Walter said pleasantly, a statement of fact. Margaret went back to the dessert table. Rosa sat back down. "I apologize," Walter said, "if that created a difficulty for you." "It didn't," she said. "It had, slightly, but not in the way he meant. The difficulty was not Margaret. The difficulty was being defended by the most powerful man in the room in front of the entire room, and not knowing what to do with the warmth it produced because warmth directed at her specifically had been in short supply for 2 years, and she had stopped expecting it. "How long have you been in Cedar Falls?" he said. 4 years, she said. "Thomas Calloway's farm," he said. "The 80 acres on the south edge." "I knew Thomas." She looked at him, her amber orc eyes steady. "He was a good man," Walter said. "Steady, honest." "Yes," she said. "He was." They talked about Thomas for 20 minutes, and it was the first time in 2 years that anyone in Cedar Falls had spoken to Rosa about her husband, as if he had been a real person worth remembering, rather than a footnote to the more interesting question of why his ORC widow hadn't left yet. When she finally walked home that evening along the dark road, the Texas panhandle stars enormous above her, her green skin silver in the moonlight, she understood that something had shifted. She did not yet know what. Walter Holt rode past the Calloway farm on his way home. Not far from his usual route, he told himself. He wanted to see the winesap tree. A tree that produced apples that could make a pie like that was worth knowing about. The farm was visible from the road in the October moonlight. 80 acres, the house small but maintained, the barn solid, the south pasture fenced with the new Glidden 2-point barbed wire, correctly tensioned, posts at the right depth. On a small farm like Rosa's, good barbed wire fencing was not just maintenance, it was survival against the larger operations that would rather her land be open range. He rode on, but he thought about it. The pie and the woman who made it, and the green hands folded in her lap at the end of the last table, and the way she had said, "I did," without performance, and he thought about it for considerably longer than a single slice of pie warranted. In the morning, Walter went to see Harlan Briggs. Harlan ran the Cedar Falls lending office from behind a desk that always had too many papers on it and not enough light. He was 50 years old, precise, and had always struck Walter as a man who understood the value of other people's difficulties, the way a merchant understands the value of scarcity, as something to be leveraged rather than alleviated. Walter mentioned the Calloway farm in passing. The mention was not casual. Nothing Walter Holt did was casual, though he had spent decades perfecting the appearance of casualness as a tool for extracting information from people who would have been more guarded if they understood how carefully he was listening. Harlan told him $160 total note on the property, $47 remaining, due December 1st. She had been making the payments, every one, on time, never missed. Harlan paused, and the pause had the quality of a man about to share something he should not share, but cannot resist sharing, because the information has value and sharing it with the most powerful man in the county might produce an advantage. But the 47 is due all at once. She doesn't have it yet. He leaned forward slightly. I'll be honest with you, Walter. I've had an inquiry, investor from out of the county looking at small properties in this area. He's made an offer to purchase the Calloway note. Walter looked at him. Purchase the note? If she misses December 1st by a single day, Harlan said, the new holder of the note can adjudicate immediately. No public auction, no grace period. He spread his hands. Standard procedure for a transferred note. Walter looked at the ledger, then at Harlan. Who is this investor? Harlan shifted slightly. The particular shift of a man whose comfort has been disrupted by a direct question he was hoping would not be asked. I'm not at liberty to say at this stage. Walter looked at him for a long moment. He had been reading men like Harlan Briggs for most of his adult life, and the tell was always the same, a slight leftward movement of the eyes when the lie required effort. I see, he said. He put his hat on. Thank you, Harlan. He went to his horse. He sat outside the lending office for a long time. He thought about an orc woman at the end of a table who had made an extraordinary pie and gone unacknowledged for an hour. He thought about $47 and a transferred note and an investor who didn't want to wait for a public auction. He thought about barbed wire fencing and the particular vulnerability of a small property surrounded by people who would prefer it to be open range, especially when that small property was held by an orc widow whose presence in the community was tolerated rather than welcomed. He thought about what he was and was not going to do about this. Then he rode to the Calloway farm. He did not pay the debt. This was the decision he arrived at after 2 days of thinking, and it was the right decision because anything else would have been charity dressed as something else. And Roza Calloway did not need charity and would not have accepted it even if she had. He had understood this about her in the 20 minutes at the supper table. She was a woman who had been making payments on time for 2 years, alone on a dead man's farm, in a town that wished she would leave, while being an orc in a county that would have preferred she did not exist. A woman like that did not want to be rescued. She wanted to be treated as what she was, which was competent. What he did was go to see her. He knocked on her door on a Thursday morning, and Rosa answered with flour on her green hands and the expression of someone interrupted in the middle of work who was composing herself for the interruption. Her amber eyes assessed him quickly, the assessment of a woman accustomed to determining within the first 3 seconds of any interaction whether the person at her door intended kindness, commerce, or trouble. Mr. Holt, she said. Mrs. Calloway, I was wondering if I could see the apple tree. I've been thinking about what you told me at the supper, the wine sap variety. I have an east-facing section on my property that might suit one. We gotta pass work from the southwest. We consist on the entire world. We can make our deal of everything new, and we can do everything new. She looked at him with eyes that saw things clearly, orc eyes that had spent 29 years reading human faces for the particular micro-expressions that preceded disappointment or dismissal, and that had learned, through long practice, to identify the rare face that contained neither. Come around the side of the house, she said. She showed him the tree. They stood under it in the October morning light, the last apples of the season still hanging from branches that Thomas had trained and shaped and pruned with the patience of a man who understood that a tree, like a marriage, required years of careful work before it produced its best fruit. The trunk was thick enough to suggest permanence, roots visible where they gripped the Texas soil. Rosa talked about the variety and the care and the harvest timing, with the knowledge of someone who had continued her husband's work, not as obligation, but as devotion, learning everything Thomas had known and adding her own understanding. The wine sap needed cold winters to fruit, which was why Thomas had chosen this spot on the east side where the morning light hit first and the evening shade came early. She explained the pruning and the pest management and the specific way you knew when a wine sap was ready, not by color alone, but by the give of the flesh, when you pressed your thumb, knowledge that lived in the fingertips. Walter listened with complete attention, the kind of listening that makes the speaker aware they are being heard, which was a gift Rosa had not received from anyone in Cedar Falls since Thomas died. Then he said he wanted to look at the south pasture fence. He had a man looking for fencing work and wanted to know what kind of work the existing fencer did before hiring him for his own property. She showed him the fence. The Glidden 2-point wire correctly tensioned, posts at the right depth, corners braced properly. Good work on a small farm. The work of someone who understood that fence was the difference between keeping your land and losing it to the pressure of larger operations. Good work, Walter said. The man who did this, is he local? Pete Dawson, she said. Works by the day. I'd like to offer him 2 weeks' work on my north section, Walter said. And I'd like to pay you a finder's fee for the recommendation. $5. She looked at him, those amber orc eyes, sharp and clear, reading the offer the way she read everything, for what it was actually saying beneath what it appeared to say. That's not how finder's fees work, she said. I own a great deal of land, he said. Knowing which workers do honest work is genuinely worth $5 to me. He held her gaze. I'm not trying to rescue you, Mrs. Calloway. I'm trying to be useful in a way that doesn't cost you your dignity. She held his gaze for a long moment. The Texas panhandle wind moved through the winesap tree above them, and the October light was golden on everything, on the fence and the farm, and the green skin of the orc woman standing in front of him. $3, she said. All right, he said. 3. She almost smiled. The real one, the kind that changed her entire face and arrived without warning, and showed her tusks and made her amber eyes warm in a way that had nothing to do with the light. He rode home thinking about it for considerably longer than $3 warranted. He also sent a message to his lawyer in Amarillo about the identity of the investor who had made an inquiry to Harlan Briggs about the Calloway note. The answer came back 4 days later. It was not a surprise. It was confirmation of something he had suspected when Harlan's eyes moved slightly to the left. The investor was Victor Marsh, Harlan's brother-in-law, who had been watching the Calloway property for 18 months, waiting for the ORC WIDOW to fail. He believed the railway survey coming through next year would run close to the south edge of her property. He wanted the land before anyone else knew why it was worth wanting. Walter came back to the farm with real reasons. He had a large property and genuine needs, and Roza Calloway's knowledge of which local workers did honest work turned out to be considerable and accurate. Pete Dawson did good work on his north fence. He mentioned this to Rosa on his next visit, which happened to coincide with her needing to discuss the water rights on her east section. He knew about water rights. She knew the section. October became November. The visits became a pattern, not announced, not formalized, real. He came Tuesday mornings and sometimes Thursday afternoons, and they talked about the farm and the land and the cattle and the price of feed. And he saw what she had built on 80 acres with the specific competence of a woman who had never had the luxury of not understanding what she was doing. An orc woman running a human man's farm in a county that did not want her, making every payment, mending every fence, tending every tree, and doing it with the quiet ferocity of someone who has decided that staying is not a choice, but a statement. He saw the way she managed her remaining cattle, the rotation she had worked out to keep the grass recovering, the way she had organized the barn for a single person's efficiency rather than the two-person operation Thomas had designed it for. He saw the kitchen garden she maintained along the south wall of the house, herbs and vegetables planted in rows so precise they looked measured because they had been, because Rosa did not do things approximately. He saw the preserves lined up in the root cellar, labeled in her careful handwriting, each jar representing hours of work that would translate into food through the winter and possibly into market income if the winter was kind enough to leave surplus. He saw, in short, the evidence of a woman who was not merely surviving on this farm but running it with an intelligence and discipline that most of the men in Cedar Falls would have been hard-pressed to match. He also saw, because Walter Holt saw most things, that the green hands that did all this work were calloused and cracked from cold and labor, and that the amber eyes that tracked every detail of the operation held a tiredness that went deeper than physical exhaustion. The tiredness of a person who has been carrying a weight alone for so long that the weight has become part of their posture, invisible to everyone except someone paying very close attention. Then, the third week of November, one of her hired hands quit, found better paying work in town. 2 days' notice, fairly given. Rosa now had one man short. 4 weeks until December 1st, $16 still needed, and the shadow of an investor who had made an inquiry to Harlan Briggs about her note. She did not tell Walter. He found out from Pete Dawson, who had heard it at the feed store. Because small towns circulate information the way blood circulates through a body, reaching every extremity whether it is wanted there or not. He came on a Tuesday. "I heard you lost a hand," he said. "I'm managing," she said. Her green jaw was set in the particular way it set when she was holding something together through will rather than circumstance. "I know you are," he said. "I also know you're 4 weeks from December 1st and $16 short and one man short simultaneously. And I know that Harlan Briggs has received an offer to purchase your note from a man named Victor Marsh, who is Harlan's brother-in-law and who has been watching your property for 18 months. She looked at him, very still. Her amber eyes held his, and her green face showed nothing except the absolute attention of a woman processing information. "That changes the shape of her situation." "How do you know that?" she said. "I asked my lawyer," he said. "When Harlan told me about the inquiry in October." She was quiet for a moment. The November wind moved through the bare branches of the winesap tree, and the farm looked the way small farms look in late autumn, stripped down to its essentials, the bones of the land showing through. "What does Marsh want with 80 acres?" she said. "He believes the railway survey coming through next year will run close to the south edge of your property," Walter said. "He wants the land before anyone else knows why it's worth wanting." She looked at the farm, at the cattle, at the barbed wire fence that protected her land from open range pressure, at the winesap tree on the east side, Thomas's tree, bare now for winter but still standing, roots deep in the panhandle soil. Then she looked at Walter. "What do I do?" she said. It was the first time she had asked anyone that question in 2 years. The first time she had let another person see that she did not have every answer, that the arithmetic of surviving alone had finally produced a problem that required more than one set of hands to solve. Now, before we ride on, if this story has you, subscribe to Orc Girl Chronicles and drop a like. Tell us in the comments what you are doing right now while you listen. Now, let us get back, because Walter Holt has just learned that Roza Calloway is not only fighting the calendar. Someone wants her land. Walter looked at her. "You give me permission," he said, "to go talk to Harlan Briggs, not to pay your debt, to inform him that selling a note to a family member without disclosing the conflict of interest is a legal matter the county office would find interesting. And you let me send 2 men to help with the cattle for the next 2 weeks, so your remaining hand can focus on what needs focusing on." She looked at him for a long time. An orc woman standing in her own yard on her dead husband's farm, looking at a human man who was offering something she had not received in 2 years, which was help that did not feel like charity. Help that recognized what she was doing and wanted to remove the obstacles that were not of her making rather than replace the effort that was. "All right," she said. "Thank you." He went. She stood in her yard and felt something she had not felt in 2 years. Not relief, but the specific feeling of being seen by someone who understood what they were looking at. Walter's conversation with Harlan Briggs was brief and very clear. Harlan was a man who understood legal exposure when it was explained to him directly by someone whose lawyer in Amarillo was considerably more expensive than his own. The inquiry from Victor Marsh was quietly withdrawn the following day. The note remained exactly where it had been. $47 due December 1st, held by the Cedar Falls lending office, not transferred to anyone's brother-in-law. Rosa did not know the details of what Walter said to Harlan. She knew Harlan stopped mentioning the investor when she made her November payment. That was enough. November 21st, $39 in hand, $8 short. 9 days left. She was at the kitchen table doing accounts on a Tuesday evening, her green hands moving the pencil across the paper with the precise, unhurried strokes of a woman who has learned that numbers do not lie, and that the only honest response to numbers that don't work is to keep looking until you find the ones that do. The lamp threw yellow light across the table, and the kitchen smelled like the last batch of preserves she had put up that week, and the house was quiet the way it was always quiet now. The quiet of a place where one person lives and works and does not speak because there is no one to speak to. Then she heard hoofbeats on the road, then boots on her porch, then a knock. She opened the door. Reverend Cole was standing there. Behind him, Pete Dawson and his wife, the Hendersons, old Mr. Marsh from the feed store, 4 or 5 other faces from the congregation. Faces that had been looking through her for 2 years. Faces that were now looking at her directly, with the slightly uncomfortable expression of people who are doing something they should have done a long time ago and are aware of the delay. "Mrs. Calloway," Reverend Cole said, "we've been talking." He held out not an envelope, but a piece of paper, a contract, handwritten, signed by 30 families of Cedar Falls. "This is not charity," he said. "This is a work order. 50 apple pies for the county Thanksgiving bazaar, to be delivered in 5 days. We will pay the going market rate per pie. Every cent earned is yours." Rosa looked at the contract. She looked at the faces on her porch. Human faces, all of them, looking at an orc woman with a particular awkwardness of people who are trying to do the right thing and are not entirely sure of the protocol. She thought about 2 years of bringing food to gatherings without being thanked. 2 years of setting dishes on tables and retreating to the far end where the light was dim and nobody would have to acknowledge that an orc had contributed to their meal. She thought about a question asked in October that had started something moving in this community. A stone dropped into water that was still producing ripples 6 weeks later. 50 pies, she said. 5 days. Yes, Reverend Cole said. Can you do it? She looked at her hands. Green hands. Strong hands. Hands that had been making pies since she was old enough to reach the counter in her mother's kitchen in Georgia. Hands that knew flour and lard and cold water, and the precise moment when a crust was right without being overworked past right. I'll need 3 times the wood I have, she said. It's already stacked by the barn, Pete Dawson said. We brought it this afternoon. She looked at the wood, then at the people, then at the contract. I accept, she said. 5 days, 50 pies, the winesap apples from Thomas's tree, the last of the season's harvest. Every one of them, fresh ground cinnamon. The crust worked with lard and cold water until it was right her mother's recipe from Georgia, multiplied by 50 in a kitchen built for a family of 2. Rosa worked before sunrise and after dark. Her remaining hand helped with the apples, peeling and coring in a rhythm they developed without discussing it. The kitchen was hot from the cast-iron stove, burning through wood at a rate she had never sustained before. The smell of baking filled the house and the yard and the barn and probably reached the road, because on the second day, a neighbor she had never spoken to stopped his wagon and looked at the farm with an expression that suggested the smell alone was making him reconsider his opinion of the woman who lived there. She slept 3 hours the first night and 4 the second, and did not count after that. Her green hands worked the dough until they ached and then continued working, because the aching was not relevant to the deadline. Each pie was made individually, not in batches, because her mother had taught her that a pie made in a batch is a pie made by arithmetic, and a pie made individually is a pie made by hand. And the difference is in the crust, and the crust is everything. Her green hands worked the dough with a knowledge that lived in the muscles rather than the mind, the particular memory of 10,000 repetitions that allows a baker to feel the exact moment when the fat and the flour and the water have become something greater than their separate parts. The kitchen was her mother's kitchen, and her kitchen, and Thomas's kitchen. All at once, the smell of cinnamon connecting her to every woman in her family who had stood at a counter and made something beautiful from simple ingredients. And the act of making 50 of them in 5 days was not just commerce, it was a declaration, a statement made in flour and sugar and winesap apples that said, "I am here and I am capable, and the thing I make with my hands is worth paying for." On the third night at 2 in the morning, the wood ran low. She went to the pile by the barn and found it lower than it should have been. She had burned more than she had calculated, which meant the morning would come, and the oven would die, and the last pies would not be done in time. She stood in the cold Texas panhandle night, her green skin silver in the starlight, her breath forming clouds that dissolved into the dark, and looked at the wood and did the arithmetic and found the arithmetic insufficient. The stove needed fuel for another 6 hours minimum. She had fuel for perhaps 3. The difference between those numbers was the difference between 50 pies delivered on time and a promise broken, and Roza Calloway did not break promises. She had not broken a promise to Thomas, not the promise to stay, not the promise to keep the farm, not the promise to make it work. She was not going to break a promise to 30 families who had, for the first time in 2 years, looked at her directly and asked her to do what she did best. Then she heard it, the sound of an axe. She went around the side of the barn. Walter Holt was standing at the woodblock in his good coat, splitting wood by lantern light with the focused efficiency of a man who knows how to do this and is not interested in being seen doing it. His sleeves were rolled to the elbows. The lantern threw his shadow long across the frozen ground. He swung the axe with the particular rhythm of someone who has split enough wood in his life to have moved past effort into something closer to meditation. He had not announced himself. He had not knocked on the door. He had not asked permission. He was simply there, in the cold, at 2 in the morning, with an axe and a lantern, making sure her fire didn't go out before the last pie was done. She stood and watched him for a long moment. He had not heard her come around the barn. She watched the way the axe fell, the clean split, the pieces tumbling to either side, the brief pause to set the next log, the fall again. She watched a man in a good coat doing work that men in good coats do not usually do, at an hour when men in good coats are usually sleeping, for a reason he had not been asked to provide. He split 3 more pieces before he looked up. He saw her. He set the axe down. "The fire," he said. "I know," she said. Neither of them said anything else. She went back inside to the oven. He went back to splitting wood. At 5 in the morning, the last pie went into the oven. At 6:30, it came out golden and correct, the crust the exact color her mother would have approved of, the filling bubbling at the edges in the way that indicated the sugar and the cinnamon had done what they were supposed to do. Rosa sat down at the kitchen table and put her green hands flat on the wood and just breathed for a moment. Outside, the sound of the axe had stopped hours ago, but when she went to the barn, there was enough wood stacked to last 2 weeks. Neat rows, split to the right size for her stove, stacked with the particular care of a man who understood that the person who would be using this wood mattered enough to warrant doing it properly. She stood in the cold morning and looked at it. She thought about a man in a good coat, splitting wood by lantern light at 2 in the morning, for an orc woman he had met 6 weeks ago over an apple pie. She went back inside and made coffee and waited for the sun to come up. She delivered the 50 pies to the county Thanksgiving bazaar on the 26th of November. Every one of them sold before noon. People who had never spoken to Roza Calloway bought pies from her hands and ate them and came back for more, and the fact that the hands were green did not diminish the quality of what they produced. She walked into the Cedar Falls lending office on November 29th with $47 in silver, Morgan dollars, worn smooth from use, wrapped in a cloth on her kitchen table since the moment she had enough of them. 50 pies at market rate, every cent earned by her green hands in her hot kitchen, over 5 days and 4 nights of work that would have broken a lesser woman and that had bent her but not broken her, because Roza Calloway was an orc, and orcs do not break, they endure, and endurance is not the same as survival. Endurance is survival with dignity intact. She set the cloth on Harlan Briggs's desk, and he counted the coins one by one, the silver clicking against the wood, and stamped the ledger and handed her the receipt. "Farm is clear, Mrs. Calloway," she said. "Thank you." She walked outside and stood on the boardwalk in the November cold and looked at the receipt. Her green hands held the paper steady in the wind. 4 years of Thomas's work and 2 years of hers, and the farm was clear. And it was hers, not Thomas's, not the lending office's, not Victor Marsh's, hers. An Orc woman holding a deed in a Texas panhandle town, free and clear. She walked home. Walter came by on Thursday. She told him everything: the bazaar, the 50 pies, the silver dollars, the receipt. She told him directly, the way she told him everything, without decoration or performance. He listened. "Reverend Cole surprised me," she said. "People generally do," he said, "when they're paying attention." She looked at him. Her amber eyes were steady, and her green face held an expression he had not seen before, something that combined gratitude with assessment, with something else he could not quite name. "You said something to him before he came to my door." He was quiet for a moment. "I mentioned to Reverend Cole," he said carefully, "that I had been thinking about the harvest supper, about how some contributions to a community go unacknowledged for reasons that don't reflect the value of the contribution." He looked at the farm. "I didn't tell him what to do about it. I mentioned it." She held his gaze. "Walter," she said. It was the first time she had used his first name. The sound of it in her voice, spoken with the particular care an Orc woman gives to a human name. She has decided matters, changed the temperature of the conversation. He looked at her. "The wood at 2 in the morning," she said. He said nothing. "And Victor Marsh," she said. "And Harlan Briggs." He said nothing. "You've been very careful," she said, "not to rescue me." "You didn't need rescuing," he said. "You needed the obstacles that weren't yours removed." She looked at him for a long time. The Texas Panhandle morning was cold and clear, and the winesap tree was bare now for the winter, patient and permanent, its roots deep in the soil Thomas had planted it in, waiting for spring. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it." He held her gaze. "The pie was worth asking about," he said. "So was the person who made it." Neither of them moved for a moment. The November air was still between them, and the farm was quiet, and the tree was bare, and the receipt was in her kitchen, and the wood was stacked by the barn, and everything that had happened since October had led to this particular silence between two people who had both lost someone and had both continued standing. Then she said, "Coffee's on." "Yes," he said, and he followed her inside. December was the month things changed openly, not dramatically. Neither of them were dramatic people. The visits that had been Tuesday mornings and Thursday afternoons became suppers. First at the farm where Rosa cooked, and Walter ate with the particular attention of a man who understood that good cooking is a form of conversation. And then at his house, where the kitchen had been empty of a woman's presence for 5 years, and where Rosa moved through the space with the careful attention of a guest who was also conducting an assessment. The conversations that had been about cattle pricing and fence lines and water rights became longer and covered more ground. He told her about Ellen, who had died 5 years ago in the delivery of a child who had not survived either. He told it simply, the way he told everything difficult, without asking for anything in return, just as information he wanted her to have, because she mattered enough to have it. Rosa listened the way she always listened, with her amber eyes steady on his face and her green hands still in her lap, and the particular quality of attention that made the speaker feel not just heard, but understood. When he finished, she did not say she was sorry. She said, "She sounds like she was a good woman." He said she was, and Rosa nodded, and the nod held something that went beyond sympathy into the territory of recognition. One person who had lost someone, seeing another person who had lost someone, and understanding the specific shape of the empty space they were both carrying. She told him more about Thomas, more than the 20 minutes of memory at the supper. She told him about the first year on the farm, and what they had planned and what the fever had taken. How Thomas had been the first human who looked at her without the particular rearrangement of expression that most humans performed. How he had seen the orc and seen past the orc to the woman, and had not considered the seeing difficult, because for Thomas it was not difficult. It was simply what he did. How the town had absorbed their marriage with polite surfaces and complicated interiors. How she had decided after Thomas died that leaving would mean the town had been right about her, that she did not belong, that the green-skinned widow was temporary, and she was not willing to be temporary. She was willing to be invisible, if that was the cost of staying, but not temporary. Walter listened to all of this. He listened the way she had listened to him, with complete attention and no interruption. When she finished, neither of them spoke for a while. The fire in his fireplace did the speaking, the popping of good oak, and the steady warmth that filled the room. The town was watching. Cedar Falls was going to watch. That was the nature of Cedar Falls. But the watching had changed quality since November. The watching had been idle before, the casual observation of people who had nothing invested in what they were observing now. It had become attentive, the observation of people who had started to understand that what they were watching might matter. Margaret Hale brought a peach pie to the farm in December with a note that said simply, "I should have said something at the supper." It was not an apology, exactly. It was an acknowledgement, which was close enough to an apology to count, and far enough from one to preserve Margaret's dignity, which was a balance Margaret had probably spent considerable time calibrating. Dorothy Crane stopped Rosa on the main street and apologized in the direct way of a woman who finds apologies genuinely difficult and is doing it anyway. "I was rude to you at the supper," Dorothy said. "I knew whose pie it was. I should have said so." Rosa accepted this, with the grace of a woman who has learned that accepting an apology you are owed is sometimes harder than not receiving one at all. Small things, real things, the kind of things that do not appear in histories, but that change the quality of a life, the way a change in season changes the quality of light, gradually, from every direction at once, until you look up one day and realize the landscape is different from what it was. On an evening in January, sitting on Walter's porch with the Texas Panhandle winter mild around them, the stars enormous in the way they are only enormous in country that has not been diminished by artificial light, he said, "I have a practical question." "All right," she said. "The Calloway farm, 80 acres on the south edge of town, good land, a winesap tree on the east side." He looked at her, her green face in the January starlight, the tusks catching the faint glow, the amber eyes steady and waiting. "I'd like to propose that we file a joint land agreement, both names on the deed, each retaining independent ownership rights, neither party's property subordinate to the others under Texas law. My lawyer in Amarillo can draw it up." She looked at him. "You've been talking to your lawyer," she said, "about property rights for women under Texas law." "Since November," he said. "There's a provision in Texas statute that preserves a woman's right to her land as separate property within a marriage, if properly documented before the ceremony." He held her gaze. "I want to be clear. The Calloway farm is yours. It was Thomas's before it was yours, and it will be yours after whatever comes next. I'm not asking for your land." She looked at him for a long moment. The January cold was around them, and the stars were above them, and the distance between them on the porch was the distance of two people who have been moving toward each other for 3 months and have arrived at the point where the movement either continues or stops. "What are you asking for?" she said. Her amber eyes held his in the dark, and her green face was still and serious and beautiful in the way that truth is beautiful, without decoration, without apology, without any attempt to be anything other than exactly what it is. He looked at the January stars, then at her, her green skin silver in the starlight, her amber eyes gold in the dark, the tusks and the pointed ears and the strong line of her jaw, and the entire fact of her. This orc woman who had stayed when everyone expected her to leave, and who had baked 50 pies in 5 days, and paid her dead in silver dollars, and planted her feet on land that the world said should not be hers. "Roza Calloway," he said, "would you be willing to stop being invisible?" She looked at him steadily. "I was never invisible," she said. The town just wasn't paying attention. "I know," he said. He paused. The word that followed was the truest thing he had said in 5 years. "I was." He reached over and took her hand, her green hand, in his weathered one. She held it. The January night held them both, and the winesap tree on the east side of the Calloway farm stood in the dark, with its roots deep in the Texas panhandle soil, patient and permanent, waiting for spring. They were married in April, in the Cedar Falls church where the harvest supper happened every October, where Walter Holt had asked a question 6 months ago that had started everything. The ceremony was exactly the right size. The congregation, the neighbors, the people of Cedar Falls who had been paying better attention since November. Rosa wore blue, a blue dress that looked like the Texas sky against her green skin. And the combination was something nobody in Cedar Falls had seen before, and that everyone who saw it remembered afterward, not because it was conventional beauty, but because it was truthful beauty. The beauty of a person who is exactly what they appear to be and is not interested in appearing as anything else. Walter stood at the altar and watched her walk toward him and thought about a woman at the end of a table who had looked up with the composure of someone who had been overlooked before and was done pretending it didn't happen. He thought about green hands setting a pie on a table without announcement. He thought about $3 negotiated down from $5 by a woman who would accept help but not charity. He thought about wood split at 2 in the morning and silver dollars counted on a kitchen table in a winesap tree standing bare through winter because it knew spring was coming and had the patience to wait. She walked toward him and thought about a man who had sat down at the end of the last table as if it were the most natural thing in the world. A man who had asked honest questions and listened to the answers. A man who had removed the obstacles that were not hers without removing the work that was, because he understood the difference, and the difference mattered. A man splitting wood by lantern light at 2 in the morning without announcing himself, because announcing it would have made it about him, and it was not about him. It was about the fire and the pie, and the woman who needed both to keep burning. After the ceremony in the church hall, there was a supper. On the dessert table, in the center was an apple pie. Rosa had made it the morning of the wedding, the winesap apples from Thomas's tree, the cinnamon fresh ground, the crust worked until it was right. She had made it because it was her mother's recipe, and because it was the right thing to bring, and because some things are worth doing, regardless of whether they will be acknowledged. Walter found it at the dessert table. He took a slice and tasted it standing there. He set his fork down. He looked around the room at the 60 people of Cedar Falls, at Margaret Hale and Dorothy Crane and Reverend Cole and Pete Dawson and old Mr. Marsh, at all the faces of a community that had been learning something since October. "Who made this apple pie?" he asked. The room laughed, not uncomfortably, the real laugh, the warm kind, the laugh of people who understand the reference and find it earned. From across the room, Roza Calloway, who was now Rosa Holt, looked at her husband with amber orc eyes that held the entire journey of the past 6 months. The table and the silence and the pie and the tree and the wood, at 2 in the morning and the silver dollars and the January stars. "I did," she said. "It's the best apple pie I've ever eaten," he said. "I know," she said, and the Cedar Falls Church Hall was full and warm, and outside the winesap tree on the east side of the Calloway farm was beginning to bud in the April light, its roots deep in the panhandle soil, patient and permanent, exactly as it had always been. Walter Holt tasted an apple pie at a church supper in October and asked one question: who made this? Not to be kind, not to make a point, because the pie was extraordinary. Their roses are sure to have this kind of texted in them. Don't eat, don't eat, don't eat out end. Watch, the best that you can do, with pang and said, Bob Hold up with a powerful pang. 5, 4, 7 meters. And the question was honest. And he was a man who asked honest questions and expected honest answers. The answer was sitting at the end of the last table in a dress washed so many times. The color had become more suggestion than fact. An orc woman with green skin and amber eyes and small tusks and flour under her fingernails, and 2 years of invisibility and a farm she had held onto with both hands. That's the whole story. A question asked out loud in a room full of people who already knew the answer and had been choosing, without formal decision, not to say it. Nobody in Cedar Falls had planned to ignore Roza Calloway. These things simply happen in small towns. When your husband dies and you refuse to cry in public or to ask for help, and when your skin is green and your ears are pointed and your tusks show when you speak, people begin to look away. It is easier to treat someone like a ghost than to admit you don't have the courage to help. It is easiest of all when the ghost is an orc, because the world has spent centuries practicing the art of looking through orc women as if they were made of glass. Walter Holt looked, and when Walter Holt looked at something in Cedar Falls eventually looked too. Not all at once, not without cost. 50 apple pies and 5 days and 3 hours of sleep a night, and silver Morgan dollars counted out on a kitchen table. Not without an orc woman's green hands working dough until they ached and continuing to work because the aching was not relevant to the promise she had made. Not without someone splitting wood by lantern light at 2 in the morning so a fire would not go out before the last pie was done. The best things in any room are rarely the ones in the center. Sometimes they're at the end of the last table, in a dress washed so many times the color has become more suggestion than fact, with green hands folded in a lap and amber eyes watching a room that has not yet learned to watch back, waiting, patient and permanent, for someone to ask the right question. If this story meant something to you, subscribe to Orc Girl Chronicles and leave a like, drop a comment, and tell us where you are tonight. Until next time.